I want to ask you a couple of questions, Thomas. Um, First of all, a while ago, I accidentally stumbled across a video on YouTube of Muammar al-Gaddafi at the United Nations on the 23rd of September 2009, giving a rebuke to the United Nations about how they violated virtually every article that was written into the charter since they were formed. And I found that they're looking at the Afwerki interview. I found a correspondence between Gaddafi's vision for Africa and Afwerki's vision. Gaddafi was assassinated 2 years later, so he couldn't go through with his programs of self-sufficiency. And so, do you see a correspondence between the two, Thomas?
Well, Libya was a friend of Eritrea during the war with Ethiopia. When Ethiopia invaded Eritrea in 1998 to 2000, Libya was about the only country in the world that really stepped in and played a significant role in helping Eritrea defend themselves. And Gaddafi had been visited Eritrea for extended time with President Isaias, and they seemed to be quite close. So, they're two very different countries, and they came to independence through very different means. Gaddafi through a coup, and Eritrea through 30 years of armed struggle. So, but both leaders are anti-imperialist or were anti-imperialist, and so there are similarities. I've actually caricature Eritrea as more of the Cuba of Africa. In many ways, Eritrea is more similar to Cuba than it is to Libya, because Cuba was the only country in Latin America that came to power through the armed struggle, and Eritrea is the only country in Africa that came to power through the armed struggle. So, and many of the socialist policies of the Cuban government are de facto policies of Eritrean government, with free medical care, free education, nationalizing the land, all the hallmarks of a socialist society. So I think this is, an important point to make when people look at all the barrage of lies and propaganda and fabrications launched against Eritrea. It's because there's a fear of socialism in the imperial countries, and especially in Africa, because Africa is the last great wild, wild west that the Europeans and the Western countries can loot and plunder to their heart's content. They've been restricted in their ability to do so in Latin America and in Asia, but Africa is still pretty much wide open for them. And Eritrea has been the one country that stepped up and claimed a fair share of their national resources. For example, the Bisha gold mine that they were talking about in the interview was Eritrea gets 40%. And that's like, enormously greater than anybody else in Africa. So if the people of Africa start actually getting their fair share of the wealth that's being exploited from the country, the standard of living in Europe is going to go down. The European leaders are not going to be able to deliver the relatively high standard of living they have been providing their population for decades now, because they're not going to be able to, just without being able to bleed Africa dry, all this, health care and education and all these other things that the Europeans provide their populations are going to be put under a great deal of stress. So I think this explains the extent to which the European leaders are reacting to the close ties that have been developing between Eritrea and Ethiopia. Because if Ethiopia follows in the Eritrean footsteps, which they are apparently doing, that's going to be a role model for Africa, what we like to call the threat of a good example. And the rest of Africa is going to look at Ethiopia and say, hey, if they can do it, and they're historically, you know, the poorest country in Africa, the most desperate situations, if they can start feeding all their own people and developing self-sufficiency, why can't we?
Mm.
Especially countries like Nigeria with all the oil wealth they have, or Angola with all the oil wealth they have, or South Africa with the mineral resources they have. How come these countries people are still suffering, and Ethiopia is beginning to lift their heads up and get off their knees and actually start to provide for their people?
You spoke
Right.
about your
Thank you very much,
briefly
Tom.
about alluded to your work, university work as a professor. Would you like to speak about that?
Well, actually, I wasn't a professor, but we taught. I had a program called Hawaii Artisan Schools in Honolulu, my hometown, where we did a wide range of educational activities from kindergarten all the way up to the university level. And we realized early on that we needed to improve the learning, the understanding and knowledge of the teachers in Hawaii. So we started a course in African history through the College of Continuing Education, which was a graduate level course. And I created the course and co-taught it with a principal lecturer named Runoko Rashidi, who recently passed away, from the Journal of African Civilization, who was quite renowned for his knowledge of African history. And so, yeah, I mean, I've taught African history and Black history from, even to kindergartners, all the way up to the university level. So I did that for many, many years. I call myself an educator and a historian. I don't call myself a scholar.
Right. What brought you to Eritrea then, Tom?
Well, my background, I've always been drawn to Africa. And about 40 years ago, I started really seriously investigating not only Black history, but African history. And in 1983, I went up to Los Angeles from Honolulu to meet Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, to invite him to Hawaii to speak in Hawaii for Black History Month. And he introduced me to the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, the EPLF. And I made bought a subscription to their newspaper, the Adulis, and I began following closely this armed struggle in Eritrea for national liberation, which I'd heard about and I knew about. And I've always been one to believe in the armed struggle for national liberation. And I began following the Eritrean struggle then. And in 1998, actually, it was in London that I met my wife, who was an ex-fighter from the Eritrean liberation struggle. And we got married eventually, and she moved to the United States, and then to help me look after my elderly parents. And then in 2006, after my parents had passed away, we moved back to Eritrea to look after her elderly parents. But I'd always wanted to live there. And we lived there for 15 years until this whole COVID crisis, where we couldn't get medicine because the mails were shut down. And my wife was disabled in the war, so we were forced to move back here to the United States. But I spent 15 years in Eritrea, and I've always been willing to share my experiences. I mean, I go back. I mean, my first anti-war demonstration was in 1970 against the U.S. invasion of Cambodia, and I spent my whole life, whether it's in environmental struggles or land and housing or labor, or political struggles, anti-imperialist struggles, in the peace and freedom movement in my hometown in Hawaii. I mean, I was a member of the Hawaii China People's Friendship Association, which was the forerunner of the U.S. Chinese People Friendship Association way back in the early 70s. So, I have a long history, and so that's why when people start saying, "Oh, you're a puppet of the Eritrean government and you're an apologist for the Eritrean government," I say, hey, let's have a debate about this, and nobody will debate me. I put my email in everything I publish.
Yeah.
And I say, okay, contact me, let's have a debate. No, all I get is backstabbing from Amnesty International and what was originally a anonymous article claiming I was talking about people I'd never even heard of. I had to go look them up on the internet.
Yeah.
And it's just typical. Either they ignore me, or when my voice starts getting out too much through these, through the internet, pretty much, then they turn around and slander you. And basically, instead of trying to debate the issues, they say, "Don't listen to him. Don't listen to him. He's an apologist."
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's pretty much standard procedure.
Yeah. And it's carries on right to today. Yeah. I was going to ask you, have you ever been thrown in jail for your views?
Well, I've been, fortunately, I've been on the verge. I was very active in the labor union movement for a while,
Yeah.
and in many of our pickets and other things, I was almost. I mean, people around me were arrested and thrown in jail. Somehow, I managed to escape.
Yeah.
I've actually haven't been in jail for my political activism, though I've had a few narrow scrapes. But I have friends that are
Mm.
or
Yeah.
been in jail,
Yeah.
beaten up by the police. But I've been lucky, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we've got a guy here in the UK who's in jail at the moment. A guy called Julian Assange.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've heard of. And the good news is, people who are defending his case, have managed to get another appeal in the Supreme Court to try and put this to bed. This because I think people are waking up to the fact that it is actually a bit of a stitch up, So let's.
Well, I wrote an article a few years back about, because this is Julian Assange is one of a long line of whistleblowers, and the outrageous behavior of the British government and just abandoning all pretense of rule of law, I think is pretty, indicative of just what a threat Julian Assange is. Now, many years ago, there was a guy named Phil Agee that I used to correspond with, who was a CIA agent that finally saw the light and realized that he was basically part of a criminal organization, and he began to expose, CIA agents in the third world and try to prevent them from doing their evil deeds. So, he was basically run out of the U.S. Ended up, spending his last days in Cuba. So, Julian Assange's persecution is nothing new, but it's particularly outrageous.
Do you know John Kiriakos?
Yes, I follow all these guys. There's a guy you may want to have on your show when he's not feeling well right now, but his name is Douglas Valentine.
Okay.
He's written a big book called CIA as Organized Crime, and it's based upon interviews. And that guy is, so in other words, I've been following the people that are exposing the crimes of U.S. government.
Okay. Well, has anybody else got a question for Tom?
Hi, Bernie. I've got a question for Tom.
Yeah. Go ahead, Adam.
Adam here. I was just wondering, Tom, what was it like living in Atria as a kind of part A to my question? I know you lived there for about 15 years. And further to that, what was it like living there? I assume in a predominantly black area or country as a white man. What was that like? And what was the standard of living like there? Because we have a perception, obviously, that African countries are quite poor and there's no food. And, what was it like living there? And how were you treated as a white person as well?
Well, like I said, I grew up in Hawaii, and back in the 1950s, when I was a kid, I was like the only white kid in our working class neighborhood where we lived. I was the only white kid in the whole school I went to, the whole district. I was the only white kid. So, I grew up being the only white face in the crowd. And so moving to Eritrea, actually, the Eritrean people really accepted me well, because I've been a friend of Eritrea now for a long time. And when the Ethiopians invaded in 2000, they were invading from 98 to 2000. They made a big breakthrough in June of 2000. And as the whole world stood by and ignored it all, I wrote my first big story called U.S. Behind Invasion of Eritrea, which was a big hit with the Eritrean population. So many of them knew who I was. My wife and I had gone there in 2001 to have our wedding. And so when we moved there in 2006, we knew a lot of people. And I never had any problems being a white guy there, I mean, I went for sometimes weeks at a time without seeing another white face, which was fine with me. Eritrean people were friendly and very polite and very welcoming, and for all the talk about a police state, I tell you, there's many a time when I wish I could have found a policeman. Not many a time, but you look around, you don't even see policemen on the street. So I mean, life there was completely different than what everybody's been led to believe it was like. I mean, there's almost no crime in Asmara and in Eritrea in general. The streets are clean. You don't see beggars like the rest of African countries. You see beggars in the street. You do. There are beggars in Asmara, but they're very few, and usually the government tries to take care of them. So, I enjoyed living there. It was, life is hard for the people of Eritrea. They've been struggling against Western sanctions. The climate disaster, I call it, has been hammering the Sahel region, which Eritrea is part of, for many decades. And for the first time in history, 2003, 2004, there was a 2-year drought. And then again in 2008 to 2009, there was another 2-year drought. For a country that's 70% agricultural and at the time almost entirely dependent on rainfall, this was major hammering of the economy. So the Eritrean people have suffered. And even 2003, 2004, nobody gave them any food. They had to go out and take the little bit of hard-earned currency they had and buy food for their population. So, I'm not saying life is easy. It's not, it's not paradise in Eritrea. People's lives are hard, but the reality is the government does their best to provide for the people, and with the limited resources they have. And they have what's called, like in Cuba. In Cuba, they have a ration card. In Eritrea, we call it the coupon, and you can get for a very small price subsidized food from the government, enough to feed your family with. So, I'm not saying it's easy there. Life is hard in Eritrea. It's not easy, but they've been, when the government came to power in 91, the country was completely destroyed. And they had to go from below zero to redevelop their country. So, it's been a struggle. And then with this climate disaster, which has been fueled by or fed by, mainly Western industrial development, the country is in the region that's been at the forefront of climate disaster. So, blaming Eritrea for being poor and hungry is sort of like, hey, they're not the ones that caused this problem. All they've had to do is take their limited resources and try to put it into water conservation to establish food security. So, but that's life in Eritrea. I mean, it's very safe. I mean, I felt much safer in Eritrea than I even did in Honolulu, where I grew up, because, there's no guns in the street. Nobody has a gun. You don't have to worry about getting shot and robbed by anybody. And the young people especially are very disciplined. And, we don't have problems with the young people mugging people too much. I mean, it's once in a great while, and everybody's really shocked when they hear a story like that. So, the tourists will tell you that, say, wow, this place is really safe. It's like very rare that anybody gets robbed. I mean, occasionally it happens. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. And it's happened to friends of mine, but I lived there for 15 years, and I can count on one hand the incidences of I know that it happens. And I mean, I live in Lynchburg, Virginia now, and every night it seems like I'm turning on the TV and hearing about an armed robbery. And this is just a little town of 25,000.
Right. Okay.